Shabbat Shalom. It's very good to be together. We are coming up to the beginning of the year, the new year. So everyone will now think I'm quite crazy because neither the Gregorian calendar nor the Jewish calendar is it the new year. Well, kind of, because in the Jewish calendar it is regarded as the ecclesiastical new year, the first of Aviv, the first of Nisan became known as Nisan during the Babylonian period, and it's March, April every year on the Gregorian calendar, and this is the month that Yahuwah, God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, said to Moses, this will be the beginning of months for you. This was at the time of the Exodus from Egypt, and so God told Moses that this is the new year. This is the beginning of months. And so we have 2 new years on the Jewish calendar because we have this is the ecclesiastical new year, and then Rosh Hashanah, which is in the 7th month, which is our Gregorian, round about September, October, is the 7th month, and so that is Rosh Hashanah, the civil new year, the year that the year date is calculated on. So it's all a bit, man gets involved and gets things a little bit mixed up. So that would be the new year that is celebrated as the new year. Okay, so this is actually God's new year, the biblical new year. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because we have come out of the tradition of the Christian church, and the Christian church does not celebrate any of the biblical feasts, by and large. There are now more and more groups that are moving back towards the biblical celebrations, the things that God ordained. But for the most part, for the last 2,000 years, really, the Christian church has developed, the Church of Rome essentially developed the Christian calendar. And the Christian calendar has very little to do with the biblical calendar. Easter is the celebration on the Christian calendar that comes closest to anything on the biblical calendar. Easter and Pentecost. Those are the 2 things that come closest. Other than that, there is nothing of the biblical calendar. And so my feeling, my urgency, my desire, my distress is for Christians, for believers, for those who claim to worship the God of the Bible, that they would rather know and do what God said than the things that man has said. So it's all very well to have traditions and celebrations that we ascribe to a biblical event. So, Christmas is the birth, supposedly, it's not the birth of the Messiah, but it's the celebration of the birth of the Messiah. These things are, we as human beings like to create traditions. So these things are all well and good if they were done in addition to what God had said. But they're not. They replace what God, or rather what God has ordained, is put aside. And man's traditions are observed as being, and if you resist them or if you speak against them, people think that you are denying the Messiah and you are rejecting God and those kinds of things, which in actual fact is quite the contrary. When one starts to study the scriptures and desire to do the things that are contained herein, the words of God, then you begin to realize there are all these things that God said, which should excite something in you. And I'm not promoting legalistic observances and you're going to get struck down with lightning if you don't observe them. But what God says should excite you, and you should want to know what God says and try and do some of the things that God said. That should come from within you naturally because you love God. And so my distress is that the church, you speak about these things and they just push you aside and reject you and push you away because it's like you're rejecting God, because now in the New Testament it is believed that all of these things are done away with and we have a whole new thing going on. And so to go back to those things, and people will quote Paul, who said you go back to it's all misunderstood. Paul is misunderstood. Paul did not say those things. So the question is, Paul says, 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1, 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1, Philippians 3:17 and 4 verse 9. Passages in which Paul encourages his followers to imitate him. 1 Corinthians 4:9. 1 Corinthians 11. Where did I get 4:9 from? Oh, that's Philippians. 1 Corinthians 11. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1. Now I praise you, verse 1. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Messiah. Paul is saying, I imitate the Messiah, you imitate me. Simple. Imitate Paul. Paul is imitating the Messiah. The Messiah, Yeshua, said he doesn't do anything on his own. He only did what the Father told him to do. So essentially, the Messiah imitated God. So the Messiah is imitating God. Paul's imitating the Messiah. We imitate Paul. We should all be doing the same things. So what did the Messiah do? Before I get to what the Messiah did, my whole lead up to the year, the new year, and this time of year, and where we are is the beginning of the year. The first festivals in the year are Passover, which will be celebrated in the Christian church as Easter, without any reference to the new year or any of that. Just so happens that this year, Passover and Easter fall on the same weekend. So this doesn't happen that often. I guess it's a 7-year cycle, whatever it is. I forget now. Whatever the cycle is, every couple of years they will match up and be on the same weekend. Sometimes they're as much as a month apart. So this year it happens to fall on the same weekend. We're coming up to Passover. And so this is my focus for today, is the Passover and the significance of the Passover for Christians, and why we should be focusing on the biblical feasts, those things that God ordained. And so Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Messiah. And so what did the Messiah do? We're going to imitate the Messiah, or if Paul is imitating the Messiah, in Luke chapter 2, Luke 2, I'll read the 1 for you, and then I'll give you a couple of other references that agree. Luke chapter 2, verse 41 to 42. Luke chapter 2, verse 41 to 42. He says, now his parents were going every year to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. When he became 12 years old, they were going up according to the festival custom, as they headed home, and so on. So his parents went up every year to the Passover feast. Yeshua went up with them. It was compulsory for all males to go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year for certain festivals. Passover was one of them. The major one, because this was the celebration of the Exodus from Egypt. And so God commanded Moses to sacrifice a lamb and put the blood on the doorposts. We're coming to that. So Yeshua celebrated Passover. John chapter 2, verse 13 to 23. John 2, verse 13 to 23. John 5, verse 1. John 7, verse 2 to 10. All of these are references to Yeshua being at the festivals, mostly in Jerusalem. And so if we're going to imitate the Messiah kept the festivals. You say, oh, well, that was before the crucifixion and before the doing away of the law, because that's another whole story for many, many messages on why he did not do away with the law. He did not. He said so explicitly in Matthew chapter 5. Read it. He said, I will not one yod or tittle, the serif, the little flick of on the letter, Hebrew consonants, a little flick. Not one will be done away with until all is completed. People say, oh, but Yeshua completed the law. It's not completed. All is not completed. God's plan is still in process. Yeshua will come and rule and reign for 1,000 years. It's still not completed. We know that because Zechariah chapter 14 tells us that everyone will go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Another interesting thing, there are 3 feasts that will be celebrated: Passover, Tabernacles, and a new one that hasn't been celebrated yet, the New Year, which is coming now. I didn't bring my calendar. I need to get my calendar. Would you mind getting my calendar? I think it's in the kitchen. 31st of March is going to be the new year. The 1st of Aviv. The 1st of Aviv will be on the 31st of March this year. And so the new year will be one of the feasts that will be celebrated during the millennial reign of the Messiah, the 1,000 years when Messiah comes to rule and reign again. So the feasts, those particular feasts, are going to be celebrated when the Messiah comes. He celebrated them when he was here the first time. Paul celebrated them. If you look at Paul, Acts 20, verse 16 is one of the closest that we get to a explicit passage that Paul is intends to get to Jerusalem on time for it wasn't Passover, it was Pentecost. So Shavuot. So Acts chapter 20 verse 16 is where Paul is urgently wanting to get back to Jerusalem to be there for Pentecost. In chapter 18 verse 4, Acts 18 verse 4, we see that it was Paul's custom to celebrate Shabbat. He would go on the Shabbat to the synagogues. It was his custom to go and teach in the synagogues on Shabbat. So Paul continued keeping Shabbat. It's not surprising, since it's one of the 10 commandments. We were speaking the other day, and we were talking about Christians, and if you were to say to any Christian, is it no longer necessary to keep the 10 commandments? Any Christian who has any kind of understanding, who's been Christian for longer than 5 minutes, should know and should say, no, of course we must keep the 10 commandments. It's the basic moral code in the kingdom of God. And I say that every Christian should say, if they're completely honest, they should be saying, yes, of course we must keep the 9 commandments, because keeping Shabbat is one of the 10 commandments. And Christians don't keep Shabbat. Well, okay, now they say, well, Sunday is the Sabbath now. Long story. It's not. It's a long story. So that's not the story for today. Paul said, imitate me as I imitate the Messiah. The Messiah kept the festivals. Paul would appear. We don't have explicit verses that say he kept the festivals. It would appear he certainly kept Shabbat, that we do have an explicit passages to affirm. We do know that at least one Shavuot, he was urgently trying to get back to Jerusalem to be there for Shavuot. So, imitate Paul, imitate Messiah. This is what they did. It is imperative, I believe, for us today, those who believe the Bible and worship the God of the Bible, to understand his calendar, what he put forward, because nothing in the Christian calendar, I shouldn't say nothing, I can say nothing compares. Something does come close, as I've already mentioned. Easter comes close, but there is nothing in the Christian calendar that is as mind-blowingly illustrative of God's whole plan as God's calendar. And so you can celebrate the Christian calendar and you can get some beautiful pictures and symbolism from those things, but it doesn't come close to the pictures and the symbolism, which is the purpose of God's calendar, is to reveal his plan, to reveal essentially the Messiah. The Messiah fulfills every one of God's festivals to the finest detail. Okay, so in Exodus chapter 12 and Leviticus 23 are the two passages which really give the details of the festivals. Exodus 12 is at the time that the Passover was established. This was actually at the Exodus from Egypt. It was when they literally slaughtered the lamb and put the blood on the doorposts, and that was to be the sign for the angel of God, the destroying angel that would come and kill all firstborn of everything that lived would be killed in Egypt, except for those who were in dwellings that had the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. Now, as Christians, the symbolism should be clear. We understand this from Easter, is the symbolism of the blood of the lamb. Since Yeshua, Jesus, is the Passover lamb, the final sacrifice to make atonement for the sins of humanity. And so a very well-known expression that many Christian groups love to use is being covered by the blood of the lamb. So that's the symbol of the blood on the doorposts, and then Yeshua is the one who fulfills that on the cross. And so his blood ran down the wooden cross, and we are now the blood being the symbol of his death and his sacrifice, which is the penalty for sin is death. Romans 9. Paul expresses it explicitly. The penalty for sin is death. And so we know that from the Garden of Eden, when God said to Adam and Eve, the day you eat of it, you will surely die. He was declaring the penalty for sin. Eating of the fruit was disobedience against God. That is sin. Defying God, disobeying God, turning your back on God. That is sin. And the penalty for that is death. It's not so much a punishment as a consequence, because if you turn your back on the author of life, what is the antithesis to life is death. And so if you turn your back on the author of life, you are essentially choosing death. Therefore, it's not God that punishes you, it's you that choose to die. And so no one can say it's God's fault, or I didn't know. So on Exodus 12, we have the actual event that happened. Verse 3, we have on the 10th day, a lamb was to be selected. I'm not going to read it all. You can read Exodus 12, verses 1 to 14, 1 to 15. Actually, you can just read the whole of chapter 12. The whole of chapter 12 is essentially the putting the blood on the doorposts, and God instilling in Moshe that this was to be. He starts off that this is the first of the month. This is the first of months for you. Verse 2, this month will make the beginning of months for you. And then he establishes this tradition of the Passover sacrifice. And while the temple, when they entered into Canaan, to Israel, and they even before, when they built the tabernacle in the desert, and they were in the desert for 40 years, they would have the sacrifice and do the Passover as it's described here, actually killing the lamb, and having the sacrifice. So verse 3 is where God tells Moses that on the 10th day is when you select the lambs. It was on the 10th day that Yeshua entered Jerusalem. It was the day that they were selecting the lambs for slaughter that Yeshua entered Jerusalem, and he entered the temple precinct. He then spent 4 days being interrogated by various groups. And essentially, this is the inspection of the priests of the lambs to ensure that they are spotless, they are without blemish, so that on the 14th day of the month, the lamb could then be sacrificed, and that was the Passover, the day of the Passover, the 14th day of the first month. And so Yeshua went through this 4 days of interrogation in the temple precincts. Every day he went to the temple, and he was interrogated by various groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and so on, scribes, legal lawyers. And so Yeshua is found to be, they couldn't pin anything on him. He's found to be spotless, perfect, without blemish. And so he is the perfect lamb who can make atonement for the sins of the world. Then in verse 8, it describes that this Passover meal is to be eaten with bitter herbs. And these bitter herbs are to illustrate the suffering, the difficulties of Israel in the land of Egypt, and certainly the difficulties in life, that there are difficulties, there's suffering in life, there's bitterness in life. And so that to be eaten with bitter herbs, they're also to be eaten in a hurry, and then they are to be eaten with unleavened bread, verse 15. And so we have Leviticus 23, we see Leviticus 23 describes these festivals. If you read Leviticus 23, verse 1 to 14, it gives you the Passover, the description of the Passover festival period. And essentially, the Passover is 3 separate festivals, 3 separate kind of celebrations, if you like. The first is the Passover, which is a 1-day event. It's the sacrificing of the lamb, and the meal, the Seder meal, which is the eating of the lamb, and the bitter herbs. And then some other traditions were added, which are very significant and very descriptive, which are fulfilled by the Messiah. Even though there are traditions not specifically prescribed in the scriptures, they are fulfilled by the Messiah. Very, very interesting. And so we have in Leviticus 23, we have verse 5, 5 and following, which describes the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Matzot, the unleavened bread. And that Passover is 1 day. On the 15th day, following the Passover, begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day feast. And then we have another one, which is often overlooked, and that is the Feast of First Fruits. The First Fruits was a very interesting feast, because we have Passover's on the 14th. Now, as you know, the months of the year kind of cycle, the biblical months are calculated from the lunar cycle, the moon. And so the days will vary. So Passover won't be on the same day every year. So this is part of the problem with the Easter festival in the Christian calendar, because you always have Good Friday. Yeshua was not crucified on a Friday, but you have Good Friday, you have Easter Sunday, and all of these things are always on the same days, and this is not the case. So the day will vary. The one day that does not vary, because it must occur, biblically, it is prescribed that after the Shabbat, so you have Passover, the first Shabbat after Passover, after that Shabbat, you begin to count 50 days. That is 7 weeks, or 7 Shabbats. It's called the counting of the Omer. Omer is a sheaf, so a sheaf of wheat. So it's a unit of measure, and it would be, so it's a sheaf of wheat or barley. The first harvest of the year is the barley harvest. So on that day, the first day after Shabbat, a Shabbat is a Saturday. The first day after Shabbat is a Sunday. So first fruits, Yom Habikurim, the day of first fruits, the day of is always on a Sunday, because it can be whenever the Passover is. The first Shabbat after Passover, the day after, is a Sunday. The day after the first Shabbat is the Habikurim, the first fruits. And so it will always be on a Sunday. It's the day that Yeshua rose from the grave. And so first fruits, the priests would have to go into the fields. They'd have to collect the harvest, the first fruits of the harvest. And they would have to take that sheaf of barley, and they'd have to raise it up and wave it before the Lord. So it was a celebration of the harvest, which is the first fruits, and we know that Yeshua is the first fruits of the resurrection. So the sheaf is raised up and it's waved before Yahuwah, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and it signifies the first fruits of the barley harvest, bread, and we know now that Yeshua is the first fruits of the resurrection. And so that day is always on a Sunday. This year, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but this year it is on a Sunday. I mean, on the Easter Sunday, should I say. So because Easter is lining up with Pesach this year, first fruits is falling on Easter Sunday this year, which is quite a rare occurrence. I do believe there are some major significances to this year prophetically, and whether that is part of it or not, I don't know. But it's just it's interesting for me that it should be falling on the same time this year, on the same day, on the Sunday, Easter Sunday. So first fruits is, we have Passover, which is the sacrifice of the lamb. We have unleavened bread, which signifies when Israel had to escape from Egypt, they had to eat the Passover in a hurry, and they had to make unleavened bread because it would last longer. They could take the bread with them, and they would have food to eat in that initial rush, that initial push out of Egypt, where they would not be able to have time to stop and cook. So they had this unleavened bread for 7 days. It is a 7-day celebration. And so you have unleavened bread for 7 days, and the significance of that, the purpose of that, obviously for the food to eat, but the yeast results in the bread going off quickly. Doesn't last because it's got yeast in it, so it's a fermentation. So once you start the fermenting process, then it ferments, and it will continue to ferment, and so it goes bad quickly because it's fermenting. So you don't have any fermentation agent in the bread. It will last longer. It doesn't ferment, and so you'll have the food. We know the significance of that. The ferment signifies sin, and so the bread with no ferment in it signifies that the bread is clean. It is without sin. And so Yeshua, who called himself the bread of life, unless you eat my flesh, can have no part of me. And so it's the symbolism of who he is, what he is. And so he is the bread of life. And so that unleavened bread symbolizes who Yeshua is, and how we ought to embrace him. Exodus chapter 12, verse 26, and this is just one verse of many in which it is reiterated. Verse 26, now when it happens that your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? You are to say, it is the sacrifice of Yahuwah's Passover, because he passed over the houses of Bnei Israel in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our households. So it is one of the purposes of these, or the major purpose of the festivals, is to be a tool to teach others, essentially the children, but all peoples. And so when people ask, what are you doing? What does this mean? You have the opportunity to share with them exactly what it means. Not only did God bring Israel out of Egypt, that in itself is a symbolic action that represents the spiritual reality of being set free from bondage to sin. So physically, Israel was set free from the bondage to the Egyptians. The Egyptians represent the world and the godlessness. And so when we repent of our sins and turn back to God, we are coming out of Egypt, as it were. And so we are being set free from bondage to Egypt. And so all of these things are symbols, are pictures, are role plays that demonstrate what God is doing, and it gives the opportunity to use that as a launch pad to share with the world, to share with others what it means, who God is and what he has done for Israel and for all of us who are grafted in to his people. And so his people are all those who are faithful to the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. So that's just one of many verses that illustrate that point. And then just another note on traditions. On some of the traditions, I've had many people accuse us, saying that we are not Jews, and so therefore we don't have to do what the Jews do because we're not Jews. And so they get very kind of uppity often. And as I said before, even some of the traditions that are observed are pictures and are perfectly fulfilled by the Messiah, even though they're not prescribed in the scriptures. They are traditions that developed. So one of the ones that I really love is a game that is played, and it's meant to make the whole occasion festive and engage the children in the festivities, and also as educational tools for the children. So the one game that is played at unleavened bread at Passover, because now the three festivals happen together, and so it is celebrated essentially as one big festive time of the year, and it's usually just referred to as Passover, but it incorporates the Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. And one of the games that is played is the removal of all the yeast from the house. Yeast must be eradicated from the house. The mother will leave some yeast somewhere hidden in the house. Then the father will take a wooden spoon, a feather, a little bag with a scarlet ribbon, and the children will have to hunt for the yeast. And so it will be this like a treasure hunt. And they'll go and they'll hunt for the yeast. They'll find the yeast, and everyone gets all excited. And the father will come and he'll scoop. Can't touch the yeast because it represents sin. And scoop the yeast onto the wooden spoon. Can I make it more obvious? And that goes into the bag. The bag's got a scarlet thread. It gets tied, and it's taken outside, not in the house, not anywhere. It's got to be outside the house where it is burnt. So all of that, if you understand your faith, all of that is fulfilled in the Messiah. It is the sin that is put onto him on the wooden cross, and he's taken outside the city, cannot be killed inside the city. He's taken outside of the city where he is put to death, and so he becomes the atonement for the sins of the world. Another very interesting tradition is the matzah tash. The matzah tash is a bag with 3 compartments, and there's matzah in all the compartments. The middle matzah is taken out, it is broken, and a piece is put into, the broken pieces are put into the afikomen bag. Afikomen is a word that is variously translated, but one of the translations is return. So essentially, and this is the whole purpose of this game, is that the afikomen bag is with the matzah in it is taken and hidden before the meal. After the meal, the children again go and they search and search and search, and whoever finds the afikomen and brings it back gets a reward. And so this is a picture of the Messiah being broken and going away and then returning. Of course, again, that in Jewish tradition, they don't ascribe this to Yeshua, but this is exactly what Yeshua does. He was broken, paid the price for our transgressions. He's gone away to be with the Father, and now he will come back and to take us to where he will be. So that's a very, very, very brief look into the festivals, the calendar, the Passover. I have a calendar produced by PWL, which is a South African group, Pad van Waarheid tot die Lewe, or Path of Truth to Life. And so there are two main ways that the calendar is worked out. The traditional, the old way, is to visibly see the moon, the new moon, and then to start the new year from the sighting of the moon, that little thin sliver. So when the little thin sliver is seen, word is sent out, and so the new year begins. This is what this calendar is worked on. Israel works on a mathematical calculation of the cycles of the moon, and the day begins when the old moon wanes and goes black, and the sky goes black, and you have no moon. So then, from that day, the calendar begins, and that will be the first day of the new month. That means that the old way of visually looking at the moon and the mathematical way of calculating it can be as much as a day or two different, because sometimes you don't see the moon for 48 hours. For you don't the dark period between the end of the previous moon and the beginning of the new moon can be as much as 48 hours. And so if you're going by visual observation, you wait until you see the new moon before you declare the beginning of the month. Whereas with the technology and the calculation, and especially using it from the waning of the old moon, the month starts. As soon as that moon disappears, the new month starts. And so that is why our calendar and the Israel, what Israel officially will celebrate, the days Israel will officially celebrate, will usually be a day or two different. So on our calendar this year, as I said before, New Year is the 31st of March. Pesach will be the 13th of April. Unleavened bread begins on the 14th of April and ends on the 20th of April. And the first fruits is on the 20th of April, which is Easter Sunday. And I'm just giving those days. That's the light part of the day. But on the biblical calendar, the day begins from the evening of the previous day to the evening of the next day. And so it's evening, it's nighttime, and daytime. So on this calendar, I don't know if you can see it, there's a dark, so there's a block. See, on the first day, there's that rectangle, that's one day. You see the dark part is nighttime, the light part is daytime. So it's from sunset to sunset. The Gregorian calendar works from 12 o'clock to 12 o'clock, midday to midnight. So it's half sun, half, you get the picture. So that's Pesach, unleavened bread, and first fruits. That's when we'll be celebrating it this year. I hope you celebrate with us. I hope you begin to take the biblical feasts, at least study them more to find out what they entail and how the Messiah fulfills them, because they all point to the Messiah. It's all God's plan for the salvation of the world. Amen. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.